Shivka, thank you, Ana Gomez, thank you all you invisible people who do all the tech stuff and all the work behind the scenes. So this is the 25th anniversary of the uprising of the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, which is the Zapatista National Liberation Army. And I think I just give a couple minutes of context because this context is important for understanding like what's going on in some ways in the films. So in January of 1994, thousands of armed men and women from all over the state of Chiapas, which is a state in southern Mexico, mostly rural, descended from the mountains and to everyone's surprise took over with arms all the major towns and cities of the state and announced their expropriation of thousands of acres of land from the existing landowning class, which had been basically ruling in a very brutal, merciless form over the indigenous population, which of course had been there for hundreds of years. So the insurrection was actually the last time that the Zapatistas have used weapons. What they started to do was to start to build their new society in these territories that they've occupied. For a couple years after the uprising, the levantamiento, as everybody refers it to, there was some negotiating with the government. Like the government kept saying, okay, we're going to do this for you, we're going to make this compromise, that compromise. It always ended up being betrayed. On the one hand, they'd say, yeah, we're going to meet with you. On the other hand, they'd send hitmen to kill the leaders of the movement. So after a couple years of that, they were like, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. We're just going to retreat into our territories and build our society. So for the past 25 years, they've been building these communities in very rural environment. They've been building with absolutely no help from the state. They completely withdrew from the state. So they built school systems, health systems, an extremely impressive justice system, and all within this self-government form, which is based on assemblies, starting at the village level, all the way up to the highest level of the zone. So they have all decisions are made based on these assemblies. So pretty radical form of organizing their lives. The other very important thing to mention is that they're perhaps unprecedented attention to the role of women. Like one of the laws that they announced when they took over the cities was the Revolutionary Law of Women, which laid down all these ways that women had to be incorporated into the governance and become equal players in society. And they continue to have a really strong commitment to the role of women in their areas. So and so they did all this. I think it's sort of hard to even explain the extent of the accomplishment. You're thinking these tiny rural communities building their own health centers, no help from the state. They did have a lot of help from solidarity movements around the world. They got a lot of support from them, but they managed to sort of build these incredible institutions, which maybe we can talk about a little bit more after the films. So these films are not shot within Zapatista territory itself, because what is the result of the uprising has been that throughout Chiapas and the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and other parts of Mexico, the Zapatista ideas, anti-capitalist principles, and ideas of autonomy have had a huge influence in resistance movements throughout the country. So that's what these films are about. They're about the resistance movements outside Zapatista territory that draw on the movement for inspiration and support. Just to very briefly describe the films. The first one is sort of documents the Congress, which is a gathering of the National Indigenous Congress, which is a grouping very connected and very allied to Zapatistas, which is a national organization, and it was sort of the gathering was meant to sort of strengthen and sort of create and organize this group of people throughout Mexico. And so we see that. We also get a look at the Zapatistas. The Zapatistas put on this big show for everybody, so we get to see a little bit of that. And the second film is a more intimate portrait of a woman, a potter, an indigenous woman, who's very much within the Zapatista mindset, and the idea of autonomy. And she also brings up something that's very unusual to us, which is the role of the local diocese, the church, in supporting this resistance movement, and in particular in supporting women. Maybe there'll be some questions about that afterwards. And then the next film is about the attempt the establishment of massive wind farms on the isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is a state, which is in Oaxaca, which is right over from Chiapas. And I think it's kind of relevant these days when there's a lot of talk about green politics and green agendas. And I think this is a really good reminder of the danger of green energy, alternative energy development in the hands of large corporations supported by the state. And to see what happens in Mexico when this particular configuration takes charge. After that is another short about in the isthmus of Tehuantepec again, where there was a massive earthquake in 2017 which destroyed these, which was hugely destructive. And this is a group of people organizing the reconstruction of the traditional ovens based on autonomy principles. And then the last film takes place in the hinterlands of Chiapas in a very remote village. It's a gathering, the occasion is a gathering of farmers there who are trying to fight against the agrochemical industry and develop techniques, agricultural techniques, and share them in order to get out from under that structure. So the films altogether are about an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards. We'll begin. Oh. Which is the kind of the main city. Actually, the main city is the capital is another city, the most interesting city. So we we're following several threads basically, and and we film as we can. It's pretty rough conditions to like go to these little villages and stuff like that. But we film, and then when I feel like there's enough material for a short, then I make a short. And mostly we've been introduced to people, because you can't just like walk into a village with a camera, right? You can't even walk into a little village like this. I mean, especially like, we can't stand out totally. When we're there, they'll be suspicious, rightfully so. So we've developed a number of really good friends who have introduced us to the people. And so they take us out. Like this workshop, we went with this group called Desmi, and spent a couple days there. And then we went back and we showed the film there. That was really cool. Last time we went back down and we showed the film to people and got their sort of response and like that. And then we're following the woman who talks about her brothers. We're following her. We spent a couple days with her. She invited us to come stay with her. So there's that's one of the projects we're working on. On Kalina, I told her we're going to go back. I want to go with her to when they go like dig up the clay or gather the wood. So I want to sort of follow that story. There's several other, there's we have like I say 5 or 6 threads that we're following, and we just go hang out with people and film until there's a piece there. So yeah, what I think, what we are drawn to, I say we because I go with my partner who helps with, who does the sound recording. We're drawn to these areas of resistance where they're very clear, and there's many of them, as you can see, this is just a sampling, right? Where there's kind of a clear consciousness about capitalism and autonomy. And maybe one thing that maybe wasn't super clear, one of the principles of the Zapatistas is absolutely no collaboration with the political parties of the government. So you can't vote, you can't accept any money from the government, you can't join any of the parties, which is complicated for some villages have not, there's been some attrition from the Zapatista movement in villages where they just felt like they needed and wanted to accept the crumbs that the government gives them. But so there's areas that are like, although they were Zapatista, they're no longer officially Zapatista, but they very much support the Zapatista movement. That's very common. We found that a lot. One interesting film that I was thinking that I'd like to make at some point is like the ex-Zapatistas. Like Angelina, who we saw here in the second, she actually, I found out later, she actually was a Zapatista for quite a while. I'm not exactly sure what happened there, but obviously she still supports them, and that was a critical influence for her. So, and then the isthmus as well. It's like those groups are very, very clearly, they understand the problems of capitalist development, and that's what they're struggling against. And they understand the ideal of autonomy, which means, basically self-governance and self-sustenance. She likes to be in the middle of things. Did that answer your question?
It's perfect. So let's see if there's any questions, and I'll give you the mic.
This is in the villages when we go to meetings and stuff like that, it's really cool. They have little kids running around. So I've incorporated that into my, this is not a too thing. Are there any questions? I wonder how many people were sort of surprised by like the role of the church. That's really surprising to us, right? That the church can be such a radical force. And actually, it's like every place I've been to, they have let especially the women organizers within the church have left their mark on the communities. And it's really crazy. Like I've been to some of their gatherings, and it's kind of weird, But they always start with this Maya altar, So in the church, they do these like very pagan rituals, right? They start off everything with these rituals, with this Mayan ritual. And then whenever they have their meetings and they have their discussions, and always a part of the program is like some example of a woman in the Bible who was like a radical badass, basically. They pick these examples and they have and they turn them into like feminist icons, And that's the nuns and other lay workers within the church, women. Who are really like pretty powerful feminists, and somehow managed to I think what happened is that the hierarchy realized that they were going to lose too many people if they didn't let this happen, and then the Archbishop was an absolutely influential figure, the Archbishop of Chiapas in San Cristobal, who at a certain point. Made this sort of ethical choice and understood that what he needed to do if he was a good Christian was to help indigenous people, to help them, gain, dignity and material conditions and stuff like that. So that was very critical. Samuel Ruiz is his name. And he's sort of part of that liberation theology movement. So, any questions? Yeah.
I just want to see if there's more hands.
Yes. I was just curious about the architects who came to help rebuild after the earthquake, and she came from Mexico City. I was just kind of curious to know more about that, I guess.
Yeah, I was too, and I tried to follow up with her, and I couldn't. She just never responded to my emails. But basically, it's a group of, it's a kind of a nonprofit that does work with, with sustainable techniques, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of young people who all over the country who are professionals. A lot of them came to Zapatista territory to help out. So there's a lot of sort of threads like that all through the country, just like you can find that kind of thing here too, right? Yeah, so I can tell you specifically more about that. I kind of have a feeling maybe that organization doesn't exist anymore, and that happens too. Organizations like exist and they don't exist. But I mean, it was all whatever, I mean, she probably got paid like a real small stipend from her organization, but all that work that she did was mostly voluntary. Yeah.
And how widespread is the movement against that in from saving the
Well, it's not widespread enough. I had a conversation with the woman who runs DESME, that group that I went out with, who's amazing. She's a former nun who, does this like incredible work in Zapatista territories and outside. And she was like, she looked at some footage that I had of one of these gatherings of all Zapatistas who come out, and she's like, only all those people were like really diehard against for agroecology. It's very hard to tell. I mean, pretty much everywhere I go, but there people are conscious and trying to like, for example, Angelina, the second lady, she has a plot of land. She doesn't use chemicals. I don't think by any means a majority, but I think it is a growing movement because people are starting to be aware of the illnesses that are coming from the agrochemicals. Like there's this whole connection between diabetes and agrochemicals, and of course the high incidence of cancer that didn't used to occur in a lot of these villages. So I think it's gaining strength. Hopefully not too late.
In the introduction, it was around all of your work in the Bay Area and resistance development and everything. I was wondering which parallels you see in the communities you've been involved with there and the communities you've been involved with in Southern Mexico.
Yeah, that's a good, difficult question. For me, I'm interested in struggles that have some anti-capitalist horizon and have some kind of sense of the need for autonomy from the state. So there is that. That's a very strong connection, and that's probably the strongest connection. Of course, for example, Occupy Oakland, which was like kind of really the biggest thing that I've been involved with. That's really deeply involved with. From the very, very early on, it set out these rules about no police can come in, no politicians. So there's a very strong sense of the idea of building some kind of autonomy. And then the other side of it is, like as Zhivka pointed out, like the movements that create space to develop relationships with people and to exchange ideas and develop practices, social relations that try to put into practice what we ultimately want and seek. So I would say those are the the common factors, and where there's always a feminist side to it. Where there's a conscious feminist groupings and like at least an understanding that like women need to have separate organizations and things like this. Although in Mexico, very few people. Well, there are the feminists. But like none of these women, including like Canadian people like that, would not call themselves feminists because they associate feminism with a certain kind of colonial attitude, a kind of self-righteous colonial attitude. Like for one of the topics being, for example, like putting absolute priority on the right to abortion. That was like that has been in many cases in feminist movements like kind of priority number one. Well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense in the villages, It just doesn't. Number one, like there's many other like health concerns for women that are like much more pressing and part of day-to-day life. For others, they have other, certain places I've heard, quite a few people talking, they have their medicinal ways of doing abortions. They don't need this sort of clinical intervention. So they don't call themselves feminists because they associate feminists with certain specific things. But in my view, feminist is anybody who struggles, for women, right? For women to have equal participation and to be engaged equally. So, so that component's always important to me too. Like I always like the women are there in the forefront, but often they're in the background. And so, but I seek them out, because to me that their perspective is always interesting and super important too. So those are the common threads, I would say. That answer your question? Or about something else you're after?
Specific examples, bases on these films.
Yeah.
That you saw some parallels in your work in the US as well.
The parallels that are like, I think I'm sort of repeating myself, that are a complete distrust for government, a rejection of capitalist values and what capitalism creates, an idea like an anti-authoritarianism, like a idea of some kind of like decision-making processes that allow people to participate from the bottom up, let's say, developing spaces. I think so much about like the possibility, imagine some possibility of social changes, like creating the spaces where ideas and practices can actually emerge within. So creating the spaces that allow people to sort of think things through and practice things.
Dissolve.
Yes, come and go.
Together, and you mentioned that with these groups as well.
Yeah, well, you can definitely see that in the evolution of Zapatismo, and for example, it's interesting always to keep kind of a long-term perspective on these moments, because sometimes they do like break down, like the whole building of the ovens kind of fell apart. And I thought, well, should I still show that? Because it sort of points to something that didn't actually, continue. And then I thought, but it's still important, because all those people still had that experience, and those ideas are still with them. And I went back to that community. The reason I know that the experiment didn't continue is because I went back there and showed the film and talked to people. But so even though for various reasons it didn't continue as a project, all those people had that experience, and it marked them really in important ways, and it changed their consciousness, transformed them in some ways. So like whatever Occupy Oakland ended in, 600 riot police cops, bearing down on us with tear gas and baton and everything. And dissolved that movement, but so many people got like radicalized and experienced the possibility of working together and doing things together in a very like direct way, and that stays with people, hopefully for the next opportunity that comes around. Yes.
I was just curious about two things, and maybe it's slightly related to the questions that you're asking, but you talked a little bit about the justice system that we and also just this notion of autonomy from the state. I think it's interesting to look at the parallels, but I'm also thinking of like, occupying New York in much the same way, and there seems to be there's a lot of discussion in your films about people returning to certain kinds of ways that enable them to have material life, even if it's not the material life that many of us urban dwellers can quite imagine. So I just wondered if you had any reflections on the distance there and the difficulties, or how the difficulties are different about creating autonomy in those two spaces.
I think I know where you're getting at. It's like, how relevant is that? How relevant are those forms and those experiments to us? And I think they're relevant in many ways. I mean, for one thing, is it's like they're fighting our struggle too. I mean, they're protecting bits of the planet that are still, breathing and have diversity. I mean, Japan is one of the most diverse places in the world, and they're protecting that, which I think is for all of us. That's one kind of level. On another level, like let me just backtrack a little bit. And one of the things people say is, well, people need, though they have territory, they have land, right? But we don't. When we try to, we don't have land that we can occupy and grow our food on and stuff like that. But the recent movement in France, the Yellow Vest movement that you may have heard things about, like they don't have land either. And yet they're doing this really radical, groupings and organizings, and they're like developing these social groups, these contacts and these groups. So they are creating spaces. I think that's a key thing. Like you create these spaces where things can evolve into. And then I think even here, I mean, there's lots of movements here, related to like permaculture and agroecology. People here it's called permaculture. Agroecology is basically permaculture. Or an urban gardening and different ways of alternative ways of producing energy, and I think it's really so much of it is about this idea of this process and this creation of the spaces where these possibilities can emerge from, rather than saying, okay, we can do exactly this, this, and that. I do have a lot of, having participated in many of these like movements and seen a lot of this resistance, like people come up with things if they have the opportunity to. People come up with solutions. People come up with ways of living. So I think that's it. Like the importance of autonomy in the sense of being able to create these spaces where things can evolve and occupying spaces. I mean, the similarity between we didn't have land in Oakland, but we definitely occupied territory. I think occupying some kind of territory, urban or rural, whatever, is kind of is important. But the Yellow Vest people occupied the roundabouts, and created these communities and developed all these relationships within those spaces.
I'm not questioning any of that. I was just thinking like the creation of those autonomous spaces.
Yeah, like how does that happen?
Have a very different character and given the material condition. But in the justice system?
Oh, I mean, it's my dream to be able to go into Zapatista territory and actually witness some of these processes. I've heard there's been two excellent, very super detailed books that have been written about it, based on mostly interviews, but very in depth and very well done. Interviews with people talking about the justice process, the autonomous justice process, and I've heard a lot of stories, and I've seen how things work in one village that we go to, where they elected their first woman who has was a municipal agent, she's in charge of dealing with all these conflicts that arise within the community, and it's really it's a restorative justice model. It's not like, and the idea is it's not like this person is against this person. They're trying to develop like some ways of so it's not set up like our system is like it's antagonistic. You have your lawyer, one side has the lawyer, the other side has the lawyer, and they just fight it out as hard as they can. I mean, it's complete. So it's a totally different model. It's a model and it requires a lot of time. And that's one thing about these societies. Things take a really long time. These assemblies can go on for days, to make decisions about what goes on in the village. Somebody brings their case, and in some of these territories, it's like has to be equal men and women who are the judges. They're not really judges, but who are the people who are sort of like managing the processes. And they spend a lot of time like going with the person to where things happen and talking with them. They spend a lot of time like investigating. Asking other people what they knew, and then they come up with, generally some form of punishment when they decide that somebody has done something wrong. But the goal is, as one of the guys said in the first one, the goal is to like is not like, okay, we're punishing you, you did this and we're punishing you. The goal is to get the person to sort of agree that this is how they'll do reparations. It's kind of reparations based too, like, okay, you stole somebody's chicken, you have to give them a chicken. You know, I've even heard a case of a case of murder. A man was murdered, and the person was obligated to sustain the family for the rest of his life, the family of the murdered man. They do this stuff like they tie people up. They tie people up to trees, you know, as for a few hours or a day or something, which seems really brutal. But if you think about it, way less brutal than the ways that we have of dealing with of crime often. But it's extremely, it takes a lot of time. It's very based on trying to find some solution, and as opposed to just like punishing somebody so hard that they'll be afraid to do it again, right? So it's like what people call restorative justice here. It's fascinating, and I would love to see it work, because that's another area you're asking about similarities here and there. That's something that's inspired me, because like in our movements, we are shitty about dealing with conflict, right? And this doesn't require anything but ourselves organizing and finding ways how to do it, right? Finding ways how to sort of, you know, rather than whatever, calling the cops or bringing some external force in. It's like that is an area that we can work on within our movements. And I think it's absolutely critical. You know, and that's another. I'm glad we got to that, because that's an example of like there's potential parallels there, like how we deal with conflict within our groups.
Questions?
You have a question, Lulu?
Kevin, I had a question about, can you say a little bit more about gender relations in
Okay, yeah, that's of course major.
And I had one more, so
Okay,
I'll let you.
I won't go on too long about that, but like I mentioned, the revolutionary law of women was probably, like, as far as I know, I mean, I don't know that much about these things, but about movements all around the world, but it's the first that I have heard of like an insurrectionary movement that from the get-go is not saying, oh, let's wait for us to have a revolution before we give women, you know, let's do the revolution, and then we'll worry about like women having power, which is the classic standard like leftist, rhetoric around women and women's power. So they didn't do that from the very beginning. They had a very clear egalitarian, equal rights for women. I mean, rights is a complicated word. We won't get into that whole thing, but they speak about it as rights. But it's not just. It's different than what people talk about rights here. But so from the very early on, the Zapatistas had a very strong feminist component to them. I don't know if I mentioned this, but there was a lot of military commanders who were women, and when the women were training in the jungles with the men, and that was really crucial because they had this experience of like having to be equal with the men, and then they take that experience back to their villages. So it's very deeply rooted, but still, patriarchy is a very strong, powerful force even in the villages, and it's an ongoing struggle. And it's by no means been won. But what is very clear is that within the Zapatista territories and Zapatista influence groups, the position of women is much better than elsewhere. That's incontrovertible for the research projects that I've read. So in that sense, but still, you go to these, even in the compound, I went to visit the Zapatista compound, the women were doing the tortilla, waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning doing the tortillas, and supposedly the men had duty in the kitchen, but I didn't see any of them there while I was there. So it's a hard, long battle. But the young women, the Zapatista women that I met, and then the women outside, tend to have a much, they're like, I'm not going to get married for a while because I want my freedom and I want to be able to do this. So they have a lot of strong discourse on equality, supported by the diocese. Like those women's groups that the diocese organized, they're amazing. I mean, the impact and the resonance of that throughout villages throughout Chiapas is really remarkable. That's, yeah.
I mean, I had another question, and
Go for it, unless anybody else.
It's like, I think it's a question about, autonomy and sort of when you have, like autonomous formations, that, and I just want you to speak about the boundary, the inside-outside boundary, and the sort of the permeability or the impermeability of that boundary, and what that means to kind of build, and all the tensions and contradictions that arise there, and what that means to kind of build spaces of autonomy that are anti-statist at the same time, that kind of don't replicate or that don't sort of mirror statist forms, and I mean, the Zapatistas have a military, like kind of an army, or
they have an army.
So I just want if you could say a little bit more about that.
About the relationship with the military? I'm sorry.
Or just what does it mean, that kind of the boundary, the inside, outside, and how that's negotiated, and how that's the space of autonomy.
In the Zapatista territory, so basically there's five regions, and they each have this sort of like headquarters compound where they carry out their, there's the cases, like the justice cases that don't get resolved at the village level, they get bumped up to the regional level, where they have schools, where they have health centers, and where the good government, and each zone has this, what they call good government council. So it's a council of people, half men, half women, who basically preside over all the serious issues that come up. Always revocable, and it's revocable, and it's also it's a word I'm trying to say. They only do it. Well, so every 5 weeks they come for 5 weeks, and then they go back, and they come for 5 weeks, and they go back, and every 2 years they rotate the positions. So nobody can get entrenched in a situation of power, which I think is really key in the way it's organized. So that's how the civilian life is organized. Then there's the army, which we don't know very much about, obviously. It's quite secretive, but they do organize, and they do train. Just this year, the 25th anniversary, they had a big display of their troops. And my partner, who was in the military, says those guys know what they're doing. They've been well trained. They actually do serious military training. And they also, the EZLN commanders, the junta, also kind of controls the relationship to the external world, to the outside of the territories. And I mean, I think I'm not so. I mean, I have my doubts sometimes about that relationship, because the Zapatista territories are quite closed right now for a number of reasons, not the least of which they've been really deeply betrayed by people who go and, professionals even. And like, there's a story about this anthropologist, and he was their friend, and he was there for years, and then he ended up doing a report that was used by the government against the Zapatistas. So this kind of thing, so many betrayals, so they're very careful. It's protective. On the other hand, I also feel that sometimes there's a danger of being, of not having enough, permeability between the territories and outside. I have to say, though, that one of the examples, last year there was a women's gathering, which was absolutely amazing. It was like 5,000 women from all over the world, organized by women Zapatistas, 2,000 Zapatista women from the villages, organized this incredible event. And it was like a million workshops, all these performances, and it was just like the feel-good event of the decade for just about every woman who went there. That came out feeling like this is an amazing experience. And so they do things like that. They do these events where they invite people in, and they hold these whatever. But it's still the communication is still somewhat controlled. Like, the most interesting things that we learned about the Zapatista women were through speeches that were given at the opening and closing of the event, and they were amazing, and they were beautiful, and they were like, worth reading. They're online, they can be found. But it was not so easy to engage with the Zapatista women. It was on any really intense issue. Like, they would participate in the workshops, and you could chat and stuff like that, but when you were asking something really political, it was like, it was not easy to engage in that way. And so you kind of felt like people aren't quite encouraged to have conversations with outsiders about sensitive issues. And I mean, that feels problematic to me, honestly. But we'll see. I mean, like I said, my dream is to I tried to go into the villages a few times, and there's always some reason. They never say, no, you're not allowed to come in. It's always like, well, wait, there's conflict there, and it'll be dangerous for you, or there's always some, oh, we're really busy right now, come back next year. It's never like, no, you're not allowed, but it's not easy to do. Yeah. Any questions? Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming out on this snowy night. There's actually one thing I wanted to say. There's a really great website that this Java Support Committee puts out. It's a blog, and if people want to kind of, and they do these translations, weekly translations of really great materials, and it's called. It's on here. Yeah. So it's the blog is it's Chiapas CHIAPAS support.org, and that's the site where they have this blog where they publish like really great material ongoing on Zapatistas and the CNI and stuff like that. It's interesting. All right. Thank you.